It's easy for a super retro genius uber nerd like me to just assume that everyone else out there has the same knowledge and experience and muscles as I do. Some of my favorite aspects of retro doodad ownership are the extra tricks that they can do. Things that I do all the time, but I'm guilty of forgetting that the common folk don't even know about all these tricks, or have the tinkering skills to use them properly, or have any appreciable quantity of rock hard muscle, like me. And one of my favorite tricks that I use all the time, whenever I show it off in a video or explain it to a homeless man on the subway, I get a ton of questions wondering how I do it, what are the best settings, what do you need for hardware, and how on earth did I get such huge chiseled muscles? I'm talking, of course, about using a retro handheld as a home console. Yeah, that's right. If you have a retro doodad, there's a high likelihood that it can become a retro version of the Switch or Xbox or PlayStation console that you have plugged into your TV in your living room or bedroom or BDSM dungeon, and you can likely use it as a console, thus basically getting access to the entire history of retro games on the big screen in the best way. This is freaking awesome. I love this feature and I hardly hear anyone talking about it, and I get so many comments from people who had no idea this was even a thing you could do. So today I'm going to show you how to do it. I'm going to tell you everything that you need to know, what you need, how to set it up, and how to build huge rippling biceps, and I'm going to do it all for free. I won't even make you buy my ebook. I'm that good of a guy. Let's start with what you need. So if you've been into retro handhelds and you've been doing the thing you should be doing and watching lots of TechDweeb videos, you might have noticed when I'm giving the tour that I often point out, and an HDMI hole. This one has an HDMI hole. There's an HDMI hole, video out over here, HDMI hole, and a USB-C hole for charging and video out. Oh God, I'm so lonely. HDMI for video out. Yeah, very often these things have ports specifically for connecting them to a TV. Any type of HDMI hole is going to work great. Usually you get micro HDMI or mini HDMI, but you can get adapters that convert mini or micro HDMI into full-size HDMI. That's what I use. However, there is another type of connection that is available on some specific handhelds, which is where you can get DisplayPort over USB-C. This is usually only available on more recent Android handhelds, like the Retroid Pocket 5 for instance. You can always find out what types of video out options you have available in the spec sheets of your handheld. However, if you only have USB-C video out, then you'll need an adapter. For the Retroid Pocket 5 connected to the display, I use this Ugreen USB-C hub dock thing. It has HDMI and USB, and I can connect up everything at once using this one hub. I also use this for my Steam Deck because it has pass-through charging that works great. There are tons of retro handhelds this works great with, but the main doodad that I'm going to be showing you this stuff on today is the RG35XX-SP, better known as the Flip Zizzle. The Flip Zizzle is my favorite doodad for this purpose because it's got all the best features for using as a home console, but also because of the fact that it can sit flat on your desk or beside your TV, and it looks like a cute little retro laptop thing. The cables plug into the back and it just feels like it was made to double as a little retro console. This Flip Zizzle was sent to me by the good folks over at LitNXT, and there's a link below if you want to pick one of these up. However, I'll also be showing you how to do Android stuff, and for that I'll be using the Retroid Pocket 5. This is my Retroid Pocket 5 that I bought, and there's a link below for this as well. If you use those links to buy your stuff, it helps me out big time, and I'd be very appreciative if you do. Very appreciative. You'll also want to make sure that your handheld has a way to use controllers. Unless you want to hold your handheld like a controller and play it on your TV or monitor plugged in. That's totally fine. Nobody will mock you or question your sexuality if you choose to do that. But I think the ideal scenario is that you're going to have this connected to a screen, and then you'll be sitting back playing your games with either a wired or wireless controller. The wireless option, of course, is Bluetooth. My favorite retro controller is the 8BitDo SN30 Pro. I love it so much that I bought two. For whenever I have girls over, I can play a retro game with them. However, another fun choice is to use an arcade stick. I like the 8BitDo arcade stick, which is my favorite arcade stick, and it has Bluetooth. Or if I'm ootin' a boot, then maybe I'll grab some of my tiny little Shanwan Bluetooth controllers. I got these on AliExpress. I have 4 of these, and they're small enough to shove in a single pocket, which is amazing for some impromptu 4-player turtles in time. You know, in case there are more girls around. I'll include links to all these controllers in the thingamabob below if you want to pick any of them up. Whenever I talk about Bluetooth stuff, I get questions about latency, and honestly, I don't know. There's no latency that I can actually notice that bothers me when I'm playing. But I don't know if you're more sensitive to latency than I am. If you're just a little sensitive latency snowflake, there is stuff you can do to adjust for latency though, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. If you're really worried about latency, maybe you'll want to use the second method of controller connection, which is to use a wired connection. If your doodad has an OTG port, then you can use wired controllers there. Usually OTG ports are USB-C, which means if you have a USB controller, you'll need a USB-C to USB-A dongle. However, you can get a USB-C to USB-A hub, and then you can connect multiple controllers to the same USB-C hole. And using this method, you shouldn't be getting any input latency at all. To get it all going, it's really straightforward, but let's do it together one step at a time. And the way this all goes down will depend on the operating system that you're using. My favorite firmware for the Flip Zizzle is Newly, and I highly recommend using that if you're on an XX device. In Newly, the way you connect a Bluetooth device is to go to the main menu and go to Controllers and Bluetooth, Enable Bluetooth, and then go to Pair a Bluetooth device. Put your controller in pairing mode and then pair it. And if you're on other firmwares like the stock firmware or MuOS or MinUI, I'll leave you to figure out the Bluetooth stuff yourself, but it's basically the same on any firmware. Now, it's a good idea to rebind the controls on your controller so you can pick which button is going to be the hotkey. So once you have it paired, go to controller mapping, hold down a button on the controller, and then go through and set the controls, and at the very end it'll ask you which hotkey you want. So you can set that to the select button on your controller or set it to one of the special function buttons on your controller if it has them. One last step is to pick which controller is going to be for which player. So in the controller menu, go down to player assignments and pick which controller is for player 1 and 2 or whatever. And then when you fire up a game, it'll automatically set that controller as the correct player. And also you'll be able to do all the hotkey stuff from the player 1 controller. And in Newly, all these settings are saved so you can fire up your little retro console anytime and it'll automatically work with the controller and remember your settings so you can just start playing without faffing about. And if you're using an Android device, the process is more or less the same. However, on Android, the controller configuring is automatically done through RetroArch, and you may want to rebind the controls yourself through RetroArch if you have special hotkeys to set up. So my suggestion there is to stick with the basic hotkeys, like using the select button as the hotkey, and that way when you fire up a game in RetroArch, it'll default to the first controller it detects input from, and you'll still be able to use your hotkeys. Android is great in many ways, but it's a little bit more complicated when it comes to controllers because sometimes you need to rebind the controls depending on which device you're using, or the emulator sometimes has its own built-in controller mapping stuff. And then there's like the system navigation, and so sometimes you need to physically go over to the console or handheld so you can press the Android back and home buttons. However, because I'm TechDweeb, of course I have an amazing solution for this. If you get yourself an Air mouse, you should be able to access all the Android stuff you need from the couch. This is the Air mouse I use. It's just a cheap USB Air mouse that actually feels sort of like a Wiimote. You can use it like a pointer, use it to do Android stuff, and use it to control the front end. I'll toss a link to an Air mouse that'll work for you in the thing below if you want to pick one up. Oh, and by the way, this front end for Android that I'm using is ESDE, and I made a guide of how I set up all my Android devices, and you can check that out in the links below as well if you need a hand getting set up, because I show you how to set up controller stuff in there too. There's going to be lots of links down there, I guess. Once you have the Bluetooth all done and it's working fine just on its own, you're now ready to connect this via HDMI. And this is the easy part, really. All you need to do is plug it in. It should just work. You might need to reboot the device with the HDMI connected, so try that if you need to, but usually it just works fine on its own. And if your device works well and you can access your games and your Bluetooth controllers work and everything is right in the universe, then that's it. You're done. Yay! You can now use your handheld doodad as a home console and enjoy all the retro goodness from the comfort of your couch or your bed or some sort of chair or wherever else you people like to spend your time. I'm partial to the floor, with some nice comfy pillows and stuffies, of course. But let's not count our intestinal parasites before they're hatched, because there are some extra settings we might want to tinker with to give us the best retro experience that we can on whatever screen that we're using. And if you're into that, then listen up, because I'm going to tell you about that stuff right after this important message. Hey there, I'm TechDweeb. And did you know that a staggering 60% of TechDweeb's viewers are not subscribed? Don't allow such injustices like this to continue. Do your part and click the subscribe button. for a better world and a brighter future for our children and stuff. Depending on the device you're using, you might get different types of video output resolutions. Usually for a cheaper Linux-based retro handheld like the FlipZizzle, you'll be getting a 720p widescreen signal. However, you might get a 1080p signal. Usually Android devices have 1080p. And in some circumstances, depending on the handheld, you'll actually get a 640 by 480 signal. Sometimes you can change the output resolution in the settings, but sometimes you'll just end up with a stretched image. And if that's the case, you'll want to either set the aspect ratio on your TV or monitor, if it has it, or adjust the picture settings through RetroArch to compensate. If you're using Newly on the FlipZizzle or Android on the RP5, you won't need to do any of that stuff because they work perfectly without tinkering. So here, check it out. On the FlipZizzle, we get 720p output and the settings are all perfect. The 4x3 stuff is displayed by default with a nice attractive border, which you can leave on or disable based on your preference. And the widescreen stuff like PSP scales proportionally to the entire screen. It's really quite effortless. However, there are a few tweaks that I like to do sometimes. For example, on HD screens, I sometimes like to fancy up my game image by using shaders like CRT shaders to give my modern display a retro vibe to it. And yeah, of course, I made a guide about how to use shaders. Link below. Another thing that I like to do is apply decorations for the screen. You know, because those black bars on the sides of the screen can sometimes just make me anxious, like the darkness is closing in on me. Newly comes with some great ones by default, some nice console borders, or you can experiment with stuff like this, you know, making it look like you have a virtual old school monitor scene to play your games on or whatever. Another thing you can do is upscaling. For example, the FlipZizzle screen maxes out at 480p, but here in dock mode we can upscale games beyond that. PSP is the main system that I would do this on, especially since PSP isn't great on the FlipZizzle and handheld mode. This is actually a great way to play PSP games on here, and you can also upscale PS1 and Nintendo DS and Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast. The problem is that the FlipZizzle isn't powerful enough to do upscaling on most hard-to-run games, so your mileage may vary depending on the game. Most Android devices are more powerful though, and they can upscale most games all the way up to 1080p with no problem at all. And devices like the Retroid Pocket 5 can upscale GameCube and PS2, if you can believe that. I freaking love using my RP5 as a home console for that reason. It's like having a PS1, Dreamcast, PSP, PS2, and GameCube all in one unit that can also be shoved in your purse. Maybe your bag, your tech bag. It's not a purse. The final thing I need to touch on is input latency. Like I said, I do not personally have any issues playing my FlipZizzle with a Bluetooth controller on my TV or monitor. I do it all the time, and it works great 100% of the time, most of the time. However, if your display device has some inherent latency and if your Bluetooth controller has a small amount of latency, maybe those together would be something that you'd be able to notice. So let's do what we can to minimize latency in general. This is done in Newly right through the front end, but you can also access these same settings through RetroArch if you're on a non-Newly device like the RP5. The main things that you want to enable are run-ahead frames, set this to 1 or 2, and you can toggle preemptive frames if you're experiencing jittering. And that should really be all you need to do. If you have issues that this doesn't solve, then chances are there's an issue with your controller or display that's causing the problem. Or the problem is you. You're just broken. I've said many times that one of my favorite aspects of retro handhelds is that they can be like little Swiss Army knives. They can play retro games from a massive library of systems. They can play PC games via ports. They can do music and TV and movies and books. It's like a little entertainment center that fits in your pocket. And the icing on the mashed potatoes is that they can be home consoles too. It's just yet another trick that your little retro game Swiss Army knife can do. Now if it could only do that other thing that we all wish it could do. You know what I'm talking about. Yeah, you do. And that brings us to the end. I hope you found this useful or at least titillating. Let me know in the comments how titillated you are. If you want a FlipZizzle or an RP5, then check out the links below. If you want big biceps like me, keep dreaming. Click the thumbs up button if you like the video, or don't if you didn't. That's it from me. I'm TechDweeb. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.